hello again, everybody. So just to maybe give you a little bit of big picture of how things are moving along. So we just talked about literacy being complex, which was the first essential about the essentials. And remember, we're not going point by point through every part of the grades K-3 essential instructional practices because the modules do that. And our hope is that these 3 days are just a kickoff and that the next step in your professional learning is to go through all of the modules or any of them that you haven't gone through already so that you're able to work with teachers around these. So I am going to be talking to you today about essentials, about the essentials 2, 3, and 4, and I'll talk to you tomorrow morning about 5, and then Nell will be back to talk about 6 through 10 starting later tomorrow morning. So that's where we are. And I'm just going to take a moment to share my screen. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see 10 essentials about the essentials number 2. There's a lot of essentials. The word essentials isn't there so many times. It's quite hard to say. But number 2, the essentials focus on tier 1. So let's talk about that a little bit. Okay, so what do we mean by the essentials focus on tier 1 instruction? Well, when we think about tier 1 instruction, we think about classroom instruction. So that's the instruction that all children are going to receive with their classroom teacher. So these are classroom practices. So they're not school level practices. They're for in the classroom. They're not system level practices. And they're also not focused on intervention or practices that only some children who need support are going to receive. So you've seen, hopefully, the logo at this point, every classroom, every day. But we really looked at the research for instructional practices that have been shown to be effective for classroom instruction with the classroom teachers. Okay, so what do we mean by tier 1? Well, typically we think of instruction in 3 tiers. So tier 1 is the core classroom instruction that all children receive. Tier 2 is targeted small group instruction, which is supposed to supplement or be in addition to tier 1 instruction. So that's really important, right? Kids are not supposed to be pulled into tier 2 groups instead of classroom instruction. It's not supposed to supplant classroom instruction. It's supposed to supplement. And then tier 3 instruction is individualized intervention that's really targeted to particular needs and is often focused on kids who are eligible for special education services. Okay. So again, that tier 1 is what everybody gets, and that's the focus of these 10 instructional practices for K-3. All right, well, why is this so important? I have some older data to show you as well. I was looking for an image like this that included 2019, but I couldn't find it. So this is a little bit complicated, but let me tell you what you're looking at, okay? These are our M-STEP ELA scores, 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018. At the bottom, the 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 are the grade levels, okay? And what this is showing is that the sort of turquoise color represent the percent of children who score not proficient on M-STEP ELA at a particular grade level. The maroon color is partially proficient, the yellow is proficient, and the purple is advanced. So if you kind of look between yellow and maroon, everything below yellow are the kids who are not meeting grade level standards, at least according to M-STEP scores. And you can see that when we look at that maroon line, it's always kind of around 50% or just above 50%, sometimes substantially above 50% in some grade levels in particular years. Okay, so what this is saying is slightly somewhere between 50 and 60% of our kids are not meeting grade level standards, at least according to this assessment. So why is that relevant to our focus on the essential practices being in tier 1? Well, it would be completely unreasonable to assign 50% to 60% of children, those not meeting grade level standards, to receive tier 2 or tier 3 intervention. Right? We can't do that. What we need is to figure out how to have classroom instruction support many more students to meet grade level standards. And even if we look at the turquoise group at the bottom, right, 20 to 30% of kids who are not proficient, and we don't include the partially proficient, that's still 25 to 35% of the children. Even that would be unreasonable, right? To send a quarter of your school to reading intervention. That just can't be. So part of the intent in developing the essential instructional practices was to ensure that more children were being supported towards meeting grade level standards in their classroom, in tier 1, regular classroom instruction. So that's a particularly important point when you're talking to teachers, in part because some of the practices that are included in the essential instructional practices for early literacy K-3 might be things that teachers typically think of as happening outside of or beyond the classroom, right? This is for the literacy specialist to do, or the reading specialist to do, or for the special education team, resource room to do. It's not my job. And what I just really want to make sure we all leave here understanding today is that everything that's in this document is because it's the classroom teacher's job. And so when you're coaching and working with classroom teachers, that's really important to convey. And I'm going to focus for the next little bit on one example, which is essential instructional practice number 9, which focuses on assessment. And that is one in particular that sometimes we think about being somebody else's job, whether that job is a person or a computer, but it's somebody else's job to figure out, and not for classroom teacher. And I like to tell the big point I'm going to say at the beginning in case people go get a coffee or stop listening. But understanding where kids are in their literacy development, particularly using formative assessment to figure that out, is the classroom teacher's job, and it's how we figure out what kids need to learn. So that's going to be my big point. Okay, so here's just a blown up version of essential instructional practice number 9. And just in case you're following along in the PDF, or you actually have a physical text like I like to keep on my bookshelf right behind me. So this is some of the front matter. We already talked a little bit about that long list, which is on the second page of the document. Those are the areas of development for kids. And then each essential instructional practice has sort of a title or main point in green, and then it has some really important details about how that should be implemented below. So there's typically 5 bullet points below, and sometimes even sub bullet points below that. So when I say number 9, you're going to look at the green headers here and move to the 9th one. So hopefully folks have seen this document before and now you're coaching on it, but just in case, we're moving towards 9. So when you see this blown up version, it's taken directly from the text. Okay. If anyone has questions about where we are, I'll try to peek in the chat. I am taking a look at that. Okay, so this one is focused on ongoing observation and assessment of children's language and literacy development that informs their education. And again, this is really something we typically think of, or we sometimes think of as being maybe not the job of the classroom teacher, but in fact, it's a really critical job if we want to figure out what we're going to be teaching kids. So what do we mean by ongoing observation and assessment of children's language and literacy development that informs their education? Well, what we mean is that teachers need some details about where kids are in their thinking and understanding in all, or at least most of those areas of development that we talked about earlier today, to figure out what kids need to learn next. And who's going to do that ongoing observation and assessment? Well, classroom teachers, right? There's no external source that can observe kids on an ongoing basis. Who's with the kids regularly? Their teacher. And that's who's going to be seeing what they're doing as readers and writers, and seeing what they're thinking, and trying to figure out what kids need, and particularly then trying to give kids what they need in small groups, or individually, or maybe the whole class needs to learn something similar. Okay, so the idea here is that teachers collect necessary information to plan appropriate literacy instruction for each student, and that teachers can use observations, some formal tools or tests, work samples, discussions to gather this information. So there's a lot of ways to figure out what kids are doing as readers. It's not just something that happens 3 times a year at benchmark time, or 3 times a year when it's some sort of opportunity for a more formal assessment, right? This is that ongoing formative assessment that helps teachers to figure out what kids are thinking. Okay, so this is a slide I actually made a while back, but every time I look at it, I still think I should say it all. So what do we mean by informs their education when we think about teachers engaging kids in assessment? Well, not collecting data for the sake of collecting data. I know that I often speak to teachers who say someone told them they were supposed to collect that data, and I say who, and and sometimes they say, I don't even know, we've just always done that. And every year we do these assessments. And that's not particularly helpful here. What we're talking about is using data to make decisions about what instruction kids are going to receive. So if we're just collecting data and then sticking it in a file folder, that's not informing kids' education at all. So we're talking about the type of information that can be readily turned into implementation of instruction for a kid. Not collecting data to share with parents that we collect data. I have myself attended some parent conferences in which I was shown my children's data, as in, here's the folder of data that I collected about your child. And that is when my husband kicks me under the table to prevent me from saying stuff like, well, what did you learn about my child from collecting this data? And how has this impacted the instruction you provided for my child, right? But we definitely, it's just not helpful, right? Here's the data. It doesn't really do anything to help kids learn. Not collecting data to figure out what is wrong with the child. We're not trying to diagnose children. We are not, especially this year more than ever, trying to blame anybody for where kids are, blame families, blame children. Kids are where they are and they're learning. And teachers' job is to meet kids where they are and move them along to the next thing that they need to learn. So I always think of it as we need teachers to understand where kids are in their development so that we can figure out what to teach next. That's what the purpose of assessment is at the classroom level. And I'm going to emphasize this a lot, not relying only on district level data to inform instruction. So the reality is we do not get enough information from screener assessments that happen a few times a year to inform daily instruction. And I'm going to do a whole bunch of examples to try to emphasize that, because teachers are told all the time by administrators to use the screener data to tell them what to teach. And it might give you a domain or area where a child may need support, might give teachers, but what we need to help to coach teachers towards understanding is that within that, realistically, it's teachers who are going to actually have to figure out what it is that kids know and don't yet know, and what they need to learn. And this is one of my favorite examples of how this works. So many of you will have a computer adaptive assessment that people refer to as a screener or progress monitoring assessment that teachers get the data 3 times a year. Sometimes it's sent home to parents. And I want to use the analogy of a vision screener, right? It asks kids a few questions, even though sometimes teachers say it takes forever to do the assessments. They're really only getting a few questions. It's really only asking them, asking kids a few items to try to figure out sort of where they are, right? So maybe it figures out sort of where they are in domains of literacy. How does the kid seem to be doing in their fluency? How does the kid seem to be doing in their letter sound knowledge? Or it figures out sort of where kids are in meeting the standards. How is the child doing in foundational skills, maybe compared to other kids at the same age or grade? Okay, so this is some kind of very general information, but it's not detailed information, the type that's actually needed for instruction. It doesn't really help me to know that a child scored a X number on foundational skills to provide instruction for that child. What I need to know is which letters and sounds does the child know? What specific decoding strategies does the child know, and which ones do they still need to learn? What does the child maybe understand about the text structure that in different types of texts, right? So these are much more specific bits of information that are going to help to teach children and meet them where they are and move them forward. So the analogy here is a much more detailed eye exam, right? So, the screener is the one that the kids do at the beginning of school, where they look in that machine and then they get a note home that says, go and get a more detailed eye exam. What we need teachers to be doing is the more detailed eye exam, actually understanding where kids are in their learning. Okay, so just a reminder that if we gave all kids the same glasses based on a vision screener with the exact same prescription, that would be considered malpractice, right? Anyone who took a school vision screening and couldn't see just got handed, a pair of glasses. The same is true in education, right? Just because kids get a particular score on a screening exam doesn't tell us the instruction that they need, okay? We have seen study after study which shows us that even kids who score similarly on a screener's test or a state exam, actually, in fact, have different instructional needs as readers. So we could have two children who are scoring at below grade level on our state exam, and one of them might not be able to read the text fluently, and another one, for example, may not know the word meanings, the vocabulary on the same passage, and for that reason, they might both score below grade level. So knowing a child has scored below grade level, for example, on M-STEP, doesn't tell us what we need to teach that child. And so classroom teachers are going to have to figure it out, right? They're going to need more information about kids. So ideally, we have our assessments that happen often 3 times a year that districts are requiring. Those screeners are giving us some identification about areas where kids may need support. And then teachers are digging in a little on a day-to-day basis, observing what kids are doing as readers and writers, or using some informal assessments to quickly figure out what kids are doing, and then giving kids what they need. So in this case, if we look at the glasses or eye vision screener example, you'd get a screener in school. The kids go to who are identified as needing support, go and get an actual eye exam, and then everybody gets the glasses, contact lenses, prescription, maybe nothing at all that meets their needs, okay? Similarly in school, what we need to figure out are all the different instructional needs of kids in a classroom. So I just put some examples here, right? We might have a student who reads fluently, but needs to learn to monitor for comprehension because they just keep they sound great, but they just keep reading on and don't really, are not really, for whatever reason, understanding the text, right? We might have a child who can represent the first and last sound in a word during writing, but need to learn to represent vowel sounds. We might have a child who knows how to retell a story, but has challenges comparing and contrasting across multiple texts, right? So there could be all sorts of different places where kids are in their learning. And ultimately, that's what we want to make sure that our teachers are able to do, to figure that out and then to move kids on to the next bit of learning that they need. Okay. So I'm going to do a couple of examples, right? Say the computer adaptive assessment, sometimes called screener, sometimes called progress monitoring assessment, typically required by your district, shows that a first grader scores lower than expected on foundational skills. Then what, right? Well, what we would want to coach to, or sometimes someone said sometimes called diagnostic, although actually diagnostic assessments are a little bit, sometimes we call them diagnostic assessments because sometimes they can do that as well. But oftentimes diagnostic assessments are trying to provide more detailed information about the exact skills that kids do and don't know. So there's some different words thrown around to mean the same thing. And it actually can be a little confusing because people might use the term diagnostic assessment. Two different people might use that term differently. Sorry, I'm responding to a comment in the chat. And I'm happy to talk more about that afterwards. But yes, your district may be calling them that. Okay, so say we have a child who we find out is below grade level on foundational skills. Well, what does that tell us? Not a whole lot, because there's a lot of foundational skills. So the first thing we have to figure out are what are the foundational skills that first graders are even supposed to know. So we would need to check the standards and figure out, well, what is it that first graders are supposed to know? And then we're going to have to figure out exactly what the student knows and doesn't yet know about each of these areas, right? Which means that we're going to have additional assessments that the classroom teacher can do. So I am not going to pick out a list of assessments, but I am going to pick out questions that we could figure out by observing what kids do or using some informal assessments in the classroom. So foundational skills means a lot of things. I would want to know, does the child read grade level text fluently? Because fluency is part of foundational skills. Decoding, what does the child do when they get to a word they don't know how to read automatically yet? Okay, what are they up to? Letter sound knowledge, which letters and sound relationships does the child know and which do they not yet know? Right? Because you might be below grade level on foundational skills because you don't know grade level letter sound relationships to apply when you're decoding a child. Phonemic awareness. Can the child identify all of the sounds in words orally? So if I say, what are the sounds in a particular word, can they say the sounds? Does the child attempt to represent all the sounds when they're writing? That's another way to check in on this. That's quick and easy and is part of observing in the classroom, right? When you're watching a kid write and they try to represent the sound, not do they pick the right letters, but do they even attempt to put a letter there for each sound? That tells you something about their phonemic awareness, okay? So all of these questions can be answered by a teacher in the classroom. We can understand about kids' fluency by giving a child a grade level text to read and seeing what they do. Same thing with decoding, right? What do they actually do when they get to a word they don't know in a text? Letter sound relationships can be done in instruction, but there are also, informal inventories that we can give where we just ask kids to read words with different letter sound relationships to see if they know what to do. And I just gave the example of writing to figure out how a child is doing in their phonemic awareness. So these are the kinds of things that we can figure out in a classroom that can help us to say, okay, well, I noticed that when the child gets to a word that they don't know automatically, they get really stuck and they don't know what to do. Or they're guessing based on the first sound. Or they're skipping it and reading past it, right? As soon as I know that information, I can figure out, okay, well, what do I need to teach? If they're only looking at the first sound, let me make sure they look at additional sounds. If they're skipping the word, we have to start talking about monitoring for comprehension. So understanding where kids are on a day-to-day basis helps us to know what to teach. And particularly in small group instruction, because we can pull together groups of kids with similar instructional needs. Okay, let me just check my time here. I have a few more minutes, so I'll do one more example. Okay. A teacher has two entering third grade students who both read and comprehend texts that children typically read without support at the end of first grade, but they need support reading second or third grade text. What does the teacher need to do to figure out what to teach? So if I'm thinking through coaching a teacher around this child, I think, well, I need a lot more information. Just knowing, that two kids find it challenging to read third grade texts doesn't really tell me what I should teach next. It just tells me those texts were, that was challenging. But what I want to work through with a teacher is thinking about why, right? Why are those texts challenging? Are those children needing support with fluency, decoding, letter sound knowledge, maybe comprehending the meaning of the words in the text? Maybe the text they happened to read were challenging because the kids had no limited knowledge about the topic of the text. Are there strategies that could support the kids? Maybe they weren't particularly motivated to read those texts. And any two kids could have a different set of instructional needs in all of these areas that I would have to figure out in order to know what would be appropriate instruction for the student. So we can't really make any assumptions about what not being able to or finding it challenging to read a grade level text might mean. Sorry, my phone is on vibrate, but it's buzzing. I got distracted. Okay, not buzzing anymore. All right, here's one for you to try. And you can, we have just a little bit of time. So maybe have a moment to think and type some ideas in the chat. Third graders' scores drop for informational text reading on the assessment between January and May. What questions would you help the classroom teacher to ask, and maybe what data would that teacher need to collect based on this information? So have a little think and type some phrases in the chat like we did earlier today about what classroom teachers could do to figure out about assessment to inform instruction for the student. Okay, so I'm seeing some really interesting ideas in the chat here. So some folks have said students familiarity, was the student familiar with the topics of the passages that they read on this assessment? We probably never know that, but something a teacher could do, right, would be to see how kids do on reading informational texts that are familiar or motivating topics for the student, because we might find that if it's something they're super interested in, that in fact, and know a lot about, right, the comprehension of the text might look just fine, right? Some folks have said maybe the vocabulary on the informational texts that they read on their assessment was challenging. So we want to see with some other texts how the student does with challenging vocabulary. Maybe there were text features that on the assessment that weren't familiar or hadn't yet been taught, or the third grader hadn't experienced. Some folks said it might just be a testing conditions thing, which is another reason to, if a kid has a surprising drop in a score, we would always want to do some additional assessments to figure out what's going on with that. Could have been a test, an artifact of testing on that particular day. What types of questions were asked? I'm just looking, was the student taught about informational text features or structures ever? Because of course, if you don't have instruction to support working with informational text, comprehend informational text, that can make a really big difference. Okay, so there's a lot of really interesting comments over here. Let me just say some of the things that I would wonder about if it were me. I would wonder, why just informational text? It would be interesting to me if a student's scores change substantially on informational text standards, but not on comprehension of literature, for example. And I would wonder things about, was there even any instruction or support for working with informational texts? What are the standards for informational text that were supposed to be covered in third grade? Did the student learn those things? What does the child do when reading informational text, for example, on a topic of their choice or a topic they know a lot about? Is it an informational text concern, or is it something to do with the topics or unfamiliar texts they had on in an assessment situation? Does the student understand informational text structures and features, right? Lots of questions to figure out that we would have to figure out in order to provide appropriate instruction. Okay. So again, just a reminder, and this is in the essentials, that we want to understand, we want to figure out, what are the standards? What are kids supposed to learn at a particular grade level? What does the child know about the standards or in relation to those standards? And then how to plan instruction to meet those needs. Okay, I'm getting close to the end of my time, so I'm going to skip some things here. But I did try to, at the end of each of the essentials about the essentials, provide a little bit of a few resources just to send you. So of course, the first and most important resource is the module for Essential 9. That's going to get into a lot more detail. I saw some questions in the chat about particular types of assessments or how to think through with classroom teachers assessments for K-3 kids. Definitely the module for Essential 9 is where to go. There are also classroom videos associated with Essential 9. So this one that's on here is a particularly helpful one, because this is a teacher who's using a checklist to observe kids as they are reading, to figure out how they're doing on a particular standard. So in this case, the standard is identifying the main purpose of a text, including what the author wants to answer, explain, or describe. And as the kids are reading independently, the teacher is walking around and talking and listening to kids using some planned questions to figure out and listen to what kids have to say about this particular standard. So that's a really helpful example of what this could look like in a classroom. So just a couple big points to end up with today. The essentials focus on Tier 1, classroom instruction. The logo is every classroom, every day. Annie, I think it is allergies. I'm looking at the chat. What we want to see is formative assessment in every classroom, so teachers know how to support children's literacy development, and much more on this in the module for Essential 9. And I will let everyone stop listening to my croaking voice and watching my eyes tear up. But if anyone has a question in the chat, I'm looking at that right now, or you can, we'll try to look later. I think there's going to be a place to ask questions. And I think it's almost lunch break time. Yes, it is. Hi, everybody. Just got that little recording in progress message. Welcome back. I am sipping tea, just in case, so that nobody has to hear me spluttering again. But oh boy, those fall allergies, it's time. Okay, I have a very short amount of time to talk about two more essentials about the essentials that I think are incredibly important topics. So let me share my screen.